Hey everybody, in this lesson I'm just going to dig a bit deeper into some of the main ideas in the two introductions to the creative mind, unpack a couple quotes especially from the second introduction. And I'm going to start by just repeating and clarifying hopefully a couple of the things that I mentioned in the class meeting, differentiating sensation, feelings, and emotions and inclinations, and try to get a clear idea of exactly how Bergson approached the soul, what his psychology was, what he could add to our understanding of psychology. And so I'm going to start there and then move on to looking at the two introductions to the creative mind. I'm drawing here from a series of lectures Bergson gave at the Lycée Henri IV, or the Henri IV High School, between 1852 and 1853. I just translated these for the first time this past fall and found it so helpful and so interesting. So I just want to go quickly through those distinctions in order to clear up a little bit more exactly the psychological landscape that Bergson sees. And in some sense, these are the components of intuition because they are the content of our lived duration. So Bergson broke his lessons up into specific topics, and these include feelings, sensations, inclinations, passions, habit, instinct, memory, different psychological functions, components of our psychological experience. He starts in the first lesson by defining a fact of psychology. What is a fact? What is a psychological fact? What is the data from which psychology works? What is the nature of the phenomena and the evidence from which our science of psychology can be developed? Bergson does something really interesting here, and it's subtle and a bit counterintuitive at first. And this is because he's radically changing the meaning of fact and the way that we think about psychological facts as unique from scientific or physiological facts. Bergson wants to say that psychology is irreducible to physiology, that it's a science whose data, whose facts cannot be measured, cannot be conceptualized using static logic, cannot be treated using the terms and the concepts and the quantification which we use to understand the external world. He says that a psychological fact does not occupy space. It eludes any direct measurement and is essentially unstable. He says, quote, "Not only as a phenomena is it a change, but it is a change composed of changes and is nothing but change. Undoubtedly, a psychological fact endures, but its duration is a living duration in which no moment is identical to another. A sensation, to consider the most apparently stable psychological fact, isn't consistent over its prolongation. It constantly augments and enriches itself. It coils upon itself. We keep the same name for it and consider it a unique phenomena because it's useful for clear and distinct thought." End quote. So here Bergson is showing us that psychology studies the flow of changes, the duration, the living duration of our experience. And if we take any of that experience to be absolutely stable or fixed, we run into all sorts of theoretical and metaphysical problems, what Bergson would call false problems. And while even the empiricists kind of see experience as perpetual flux and change, they do turn sensation into something static because they turn it into this atomic information. Qualities are basically like pixels in a computer that is in our brain creating representations, these secondary properties. And at the base of all this is Bergson's observation that every fact, every unique moment of our experience, whether it's feelings, sensations, inclinations, ideas, whatever, memories, they are unique. They have their moment in time that cannot be substituted or overlaid on any other moment. No two moments of our duration, of our experience, is identical to any other, and it cannot be superimposed one on the other or substituted one for the other. And this is partly due to the arrow of time, we might say, which is a more contemporary term in thermodynamics and systems theory. Each moment relates to every other moment in a certain series, and the series cannot be changed or reversed or anything. And it is also in this sense that every moment of time is heterogeneous. And while the moments of our duration are completely heterogeneous in one sense, they also have continuity and contrast. They're also indivisible. Within the multiplicity and heterogeneity of our experience, there is also organization and convergence, as well as dissipation and exhaustion. Movements are composing into stable patterns, but they are also dissipating and dissolving. So our psychical facts are transitory and qualitatively heterogeneous, but they are also organized organically or organismically. The facts of our experience aren't these disconnected bits of information, but complex relational webs of meaning within contexts. Psychological facts, which are already compositions of movements, combined and form into larger wholes. Thoughts, feelings, and emotions can integrate and form a sort of life of their own, a sort of internal organization akin to a living organism, living within our psychological world. And this is, in a way, Bergson's metaphysics of life already at work in his psychology. Life is an ongoing dynamic adaptation and evolution, coordinating, organizing activity and movement, and creating a convergence of multiplicity that forms a unity that is greater than the sum of the parts. So a intuition is going to envelop a infinite multiplicity and a growing infinite multiplicity of psychic details, psychic facts, amassing them in duration and enriching them, and ultimately combining them and integrating them in a way that something greater than the sum of the parts emerges. Bergson would call this something like a higher degree of tension within consciousness. And this boils down to the realization that certain facts, certain psychological facts, unleash metaphysical implications. Basically that not all facts are the same, and the facts, again, are heterogeneous, so they can't all be the same exactly. Some facts, because of their vividness, liveliness, and complexity, force us to invent a new way of understanding them. The concepts which we form to understand the parts cannot simply be added together in order to understand the way that they integrate in a unity together. The logic of the parts and the logic of analysis in general are stepped over entirely as we move past them towards an immediate grasp of the sense of the problem. And that is where we are called to invent a new concept, but a concept of a higher order of magnitude, of a completely different logic and structure to that of the static concepts of our representation and to measurements. So just to name a few psychical facts that Bergson shows unleash metaphysical implications are, first and foremost, the experience of motion, and especially motion as the first-hand experience of mobility, or what we might call motricity, our ability to move around within the world. What we might call the interiority of movement. Here, movement is experienced as a continuous variation, and the metaphysical implication is related to irreversibility and the proliferation of an infinite number of singular moments in time. Another fact with metaphysical implications is that of integration, and here Bergson thinks about calculus. And calculus, in some ways, is the intellect's attempt to jump to a higher order of magnitude in its conception, in its concepts. It is a concept with infinite extension. Take an example as simple as a curve. A curve understood mathematically can be understood from two perspectives. One, that of analysis. Two, that of the interiority of motion. And the continuity of change within a curve is that every time it moves, every moment the line advances, it also changes direction slightly. It involves, in addition to its movement, a tendency to alter and change its movement. A tendency, according to Bergson, is a nascent change of direction. What analysis sees, what the intellect sees, is an infinite number of linear movements in the form of tangents which touch the curve, and at every moment we substitute the curving movement that implies a tendency and interior experience. The intellect sees an infinite number of different moments on a curve, each one implying a unique tangent and a unique movement. And the curve itself, considered as a whole, considered as a continuity, envelops an infinite multiplicity of differences within a simple unity. And so Bergson looks at this two-sidedness of calculus, that it implies an infinite analysis through a substitution, translating the movement from something that it is into something that it's not, from transience and heterogeneity into homogeneous. So the metaphysical implication that this involves is that our mind is capable of not simply this synthesis of an infinite multiplicity of differences and heterogeneity, but it's capable of integrating infinite multiplicities in such a way that enriches them gradually through this becoming. And so basically Bergson is saying that certain facts unleash metaphysical implications, and this is especially true of basically anything relating to our vitality or our duration. Every aspect of the duration of our lived experience involves motion and integration. And so basically through an effort of attention, we can dilate, expand, and make contract and converge the details of our memory, of our experience. And by expanding essentially infinitely our consciousness, our psychical tension that connects and pulls together details of our memory, we enrich our duration by combining and integrating a greater and greater complexity, and is organized organically. So that is the sort of strange place that Bergson takes us to in his analysis of facts. A psychological fact is a organized change composed of changes. And again, it's the gradual enrichment over time within duration of feelings, where these states draw more out of themselves than they contain. The intensity of the whole increases because of a reciprocal amplification among the multiplicity. And it is this fact above all which we form an intuition of in Bergson's philosophy. It is the intuition from which metaphysics begins. Okay, so moving on to talk about just a few things from the next few chapters of these lessons on psychology. He moves on to look at affective phenomena, sensations, feelings, inclinations, and tendencies, the passions, and then on sensibility in general. And I'm just going to go through really quick and unpack each of these and contrast it with the others. So affective phenomena envelops every type of psychical fact that involves either pleasure or pain. And so, as it turns out, affective phenomena envelops sensations, feelings, inclinations, passions, and sensibility in general. But each of these is affective in slightly different ways, so that's something we're going to have to look more at. But the key to the idea of affective phenomena is that an affect is not only a feeling of pleasure or pain, it's also a change in power and activity. Pleasure involves an increase in potential and activity. It is invigorating. It is stimulating. It increases the intensity and the potentiality. While pain, on the other hand, is a diminution and weakening. It is depressing and fatiguing. So yeah, affective phenomena encapsulates the feeling of pleasure, but also the accompanying changes to the organism that occur in the process. Things like attentiveness, which then affords a greater ability to move and to perceive and to respond to its environment. And this also implies that pleasure is not just a sort of carrot on the end of a stick. It's not something that we pursue and go after. It is also the thrust behind our action, motivating us and carrying us forward, increasing our energy and focusing it. And so then Bergson goes on to look at sensations and feelings, and they imply affects. They imply pleasure and pain in different ways. So a sensation is this sort of physiological modification of our body. And here we can think of like going into a sauna or something like that. Suddenly we are inundated with all of these sensations, and a lot of this has to do with our body's reaction to this change in environment. The warmth, the heat is of course part of this experience, but a lot of this experience has to do with the physiological changes within our body, going so far as to eventually start to mount an effort to protect our body from these extreme heats. And so we have to remember that sensations are always integrating into larger wholes that have to do with our body's coordination and its needs and its movement within the world. And we can compare this to feelings. Again, in French, this is sensation versus sentiment, sentiment. Feelings are a higher layer of generality, a larger, more complex and varied integration of sensations, as well as relating to ideas or involving images and representations. And in some sense, a feeling is this connection or relation between a multiplicity of sensations and ideas. It's kind of reaction between these two. And they sort of mutually make each other emerge. So he analyzes the feeling of fear, for example. And fear is a kind of dialectical movement between the physiological changes to our body and the idea of danger. We sort of bounce back and forth between these as our heart rate increases and our breath becomes shallow and our muscles tense, things like this. We also start to condense our attention and our memory into certain images that anticipate danger. In some sense, the field of possibilities of our expectations is closed, is diminished, is made smaller. And so there's a sort of feedback between the sensations as they coordinate into this overall characteristic of the body in the state of fear, anxiety. The sensations call for the ideas, and the ideas call for the sensations. Emotion, in a way, feeling, is this double movement in both directions of sensations converging into images, and ideas dissipating into movements. So feelings can arise either more so from the sensations or from the ideas, but it's always a combination of the two. Fear arising more from sensations, and then he looks at remorse, which involves an awareness of a fault done, as well as a system of good intentions and initiated or imagined actions. So this emotion involves what he calls a backward movement, undoing what was done. And what this means is that we imagine an alternative where we didn't do this bad thing, where we didn't commit this fault. And then we would contrast this to the fact of having done it, and then with that we have a sense of disappointment. So remorse is obviously a painful emotion involving something like regret, but is different than regret. And so Bergson says that it is the sketched or performed action that we have within our consciousness, which is what we're reacting to. So we're not really reacting to sensations, but we're reacting to these representations and ideas, and this will of course create physiological sensations, and it will also increase the number of memories connected to it, and all of this will gradually intensify this emotion. So feelings intensify by integrating a greater number of sensations and by increasing the details of memory, or by gradually distilling an image or representation. He suggests that maybe we should use the term emotion to relate to sensations primarily, and we should call feelings the same sort of states, but arising with respect to our action, our memory, and our volition. Which is to say that they have their origin from within rather than from without, but it's clear that both the from within and the from without imply the opposites. The emotion arising from sensation involves the interiority of representation and idea. The feeling that arises as a response to our representations and ideas involves certain sensations within the body as well. Okay, moving on, he then goes on to talk about inclinations, and inclinations are different again from sensations and feelings. First of all, an inclination is something that we can only witness the effects of. It is the tendency, this sort of nascent change of direction that is not directly perceivable by consciousness. And an inclination can appear as a sort of lack. It's a sort of need. It is a way of being oriented, but not oriented towards a positive object, but more propelling us in a certain direction of movement. Our bodily needs form inclinations, but so do things like egoism or even altruism, and in general a sort of social tendency. While egoism is, according to Bergson, a kind of habituated state, a way that we get ourselves into rather than something natural. Our social and altruistic tendencies are more instinctive and spontaneous. And inclinations are somewhat similar to passions, and passions, Bergson here means a emotional and, you might say, affective state of concentrating or distracting. And it is the passions of concentration, a sort of heightened state of attention, that is essential to the work of philosophy itself and to psychology. All right, that was a large detour to start things off, so now let's move to the creative mind, the two introductions. And I think that we're going to be able to draw on these distinctions, and it's going to really help us make sense of his ideas. So we talked about monism in our discussion, and this is so important. And I brought up there this notion of images, which comes from chapter 1 of Bergson's Matter and Memory. And we can connect that first here with Bergson's notion of psychical facts, as we saw in the psychology lectures. Essentially, the monism looks at a plenum of durations which both interpenetrate one another and sort of transcend each other. In the same way, images interpenetrate each other but are also differentiated. And again, here we need to think of the moments of duration as interpenetrating and connected in the same way that every moment of a curve is part of that continuous whole, and yet each is distinct and can be analyzed as different and unique and singular. And this is, of course, not the external world as we see it through analysis, but is the way that realities weave into each other in their duration. The external world is seen as a exterior, as parts in juxtaposition next to each other, but different by being next to each other. And the external world is one of translation. It is not the immediate experience of things, but one which is structured by some basic structural, conceptual components. And these are not heterogeneous, they are homogeneous. We substitute the singularity and difference and heterogeneity with its translation, with something general and measurable, and in which one space can always be substituted with another space because they are abstract. And Bergson says that when we try to understand the external world, we measure it. This is one of the things that we do, and every measurement in space implies the possibility of placing one space on top of another one, overlaying them and measuring one to the other one based on this overlay. And this is exactly what we cannot do with sensations, with feelings. We cannot lay one on the other, not even when we isolate certain qualities. So, for instance, there were experiments being done in the realm of psychophysics at the time, which was the study of the physical and psychical relation. Experiments in particular by Weber and Fechner. They would do research on our perception of light, for instance, and you would have a light bulb connected to a battery with a switch that lets you dial in exactly the voltage that the light bulb is receiving. The experiment then works by determining at what point a change in voltage, a change in the underlying power of the sensation, succeeds at being noticeable to the observer. So you could imagine that 7 and 7.2 volts are not very different and perhaps is unnoticeable to the observer. But the difference between 7 and 8 volts is certainly noticeable. The thought then is basically you can find what on average is the minimal sensible difference. Take a sample of many different patients and find out that it's around 0.1 or 0.6 or some number. And this number becomes the constant, the sort of underlying causal generality. You know, all sensations are reducible in some sense to this minimal excitation, this minimal causal moment of having the stimuli reach a level of noticeability. And so essentially psychophysics attempts to reduce all sensations considered in their qualitative appearance to an underlying mechanism within the material. And thus sensation is actually reduced to a mechanical, quantifiable external cause. And the qualitative richness, the heterogeneity of our psychic states are substituted by this translation into a quantity. And this approach to sensation in psychophysics, which was the study of the physiological, psychological connection during his time, made the same mistake that Bergson saw everywhere in science, where everything that is heterogeneous, temporal, durational, is substituted with something homogeneous and static and general. And Bergson wants to say that this is part of our natural, pragmatic approach to life, that it's part and parcel with the needs of our physical, biological being. He says that we form an idea of other bodies outside of our own body by an analogy. So this is not a fact of our experience. The fact of our experience is the blurriness of one body and another, and that being our body with the rest of the universe. So we demarcate a difference based on a proprioception, a autoaffection, a sense of our own being and our own body. And, I already mentioned that for Bergson, our body is an organized system of sensations and movements. It's a unity of this manifold, and we experience that especially with respect to our mobility, our ability to move around as a free mobile. And it's from this experience, from experiencing our body as a free mobile within space, that we then extract from that experience the concept of a thing, an identity which retains its self-sameness over duration, over a change. So I move from one room to another, and I am the same being that is from the start to the finish. And so I extrapolate from this experience a concept of identity amid change, and then project this onto bodies external to my own. So we can think of Bergson here as a constructivist, and this is a term that Deleuze will adopt later. A constructivist is not the same as a sort of relativist, that all thoughts and all concepts are purely made up or just conventional entirely. But it's to say that every concept has a history. It has a sort of set of contingent events that concatenated came together in order to bring about the emergence of this concept. And this concept of a thing, of an external entity, is a composition of inner experiences projected outward and then looked at as if this externalized projection was a fact accessible intersubjectively within the social sphere. So let me unpack that all a bit. We start with this intuitive durational content, which is our motricity, our sensory motor apparatus, and its organization. And by slowly removing the richness and complexity, the singularity of our own duration, we are finally left with a generalization that describes the sort of salient features of our predictions about the flow of becoming. We shift from a ordinary intuitive sense of our lived experience to a inductive analytical approach. And again, the sense of identity, of stability, and of an abstract unity, these are all, again, extracted from this intuitive experience of our own inner life. So Bergson says that we get a sense of sort of inertia and identity and sameness over time from a self-awareness of our own habitual states. We have the same attitude while undergoing a series of changes that are each distinct and different. So each of these experiences is, of course, heterogeneous and transient, as we've seen already, but it's possible that we form a habitual attitude which abides in its sameness across duration. And we gain a sort of insight into ourself when we notice that we have a habit, that we have an attitude. And what we see there is the possibility of stability among change. And then we take these intuitive self-awareness moments, the one of our body, the other of our attitude, and we sort of just remove everything that was particular about them, everything that made them concrete to the situations of our life. And voila, we have the outline of a thing, of an object existing outside of us. And we can now project this concept anywhere we like. And the psychophysicists who want to reduce our sensation to external stimuli of a certain magnitude, all they're doing is taking this very abstractive logic to its furthest possible conclusion. And Bergson actually praises them for this. He says we needed to do this in order to see that it couldn't go that far, that we were wrong in attempting to do that. And so to sum up this point that Bergson is making, this will distill down to a difference in the way we understand and approach multiplicity. On the one hand, we have a quantitative multiplicity that is defined by its homogeneity. And on the other hand, we have qualitative multiplicity, which again is heterogeneous. And so Bergson's method of intuition is really a method of getting us back in touch with qualitative multiplicity and providing us with a sort of experimental framework in which each of us can undergo the evidence and gather for ourselves the evidence of these fundamental realities of qualitative multiplicity, which is again another name for the structure of our inner sense of duration. So to bring this to life for us, Bergson asks us to turn to our own inner experience and see how it is. Here's a quote from page 71. In some versions, this is 82. He says, "Let us hasten to add that a method that is being proposed is understood only if it is applied to an example. In this case, the example was ready to hand. It was a matter of getting once more to the point where we could grasp the inner life beneath the juxtaposition of our states that we effect in a spatialized time. The experiment was within reach of everyone, and those who were willing to make it had no difficulty in getting an idea of the substantiality of the ego as of its duration. It is, as we were saying, indivisible and indestructible continuity of a melody, where the past enters into the present and forms with it an indivisible whole, which remains undivided and even indivisible in spite of what is added at every instance, or rather, thanks to what is added. We have an intuition of it. But as soon as we seek an intellectual representation of it, we line up, one after the other, states which have become distinct, like the beads of a necklace, and therefore require, in order to hold them together, a thread which is neither this nor that, nor nothing that resembles beads, nothing that resembles anything whatsoever, an empty entity, a simple word. Intuition gives us the thing whose spatial transposition, whose metaphorical translation alone is seized by the intellect." End quote. So here we have Bergson applying his method immediately to something a experience, in this case music, which doesn't require us to have a science. It doesn't require us to engage with scientific literature or even the literature of art criticism or philosophy of music or the cognitive science of music or anything like that. We need to just experience it for ourselves. And here I have this brilliant example from this video where someone has put emojis essentially for each chord within Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. So let's take a look at that. In order to make a video like this, you had to have really sat with the experience of hearing Moonlight Sonata and really sat with the feeling of each chord and made an effort to express this to other people, to give it a symbol which can have meaning to us, and that's these emojis. That an effort is necessary which translates this intimate sense that we have while experiencing the song into something that others would say, ah, yes, I too felt something similar. And, you know, these emojis feel accurate in some sense. They do give us some of making sense of the shifting emotions that happen across this chord progression. They sort of help us understand that and help us talk about that. And likewise, they can help the performer give a more emotional performance of each chord that brings out the essence of each of these emotional spaces. And while that's well and good, it doesn't really express the interconnection that these moments have to one another in the flow of the duration, which is this evolving, indivisible feeling. Because they are felt in close succession and because the past is still there in the present, it's still making sense of the present, the melody is both accumulating a greater mass of sensations and continuously enriching the content and qualitative multiplicity of the content. It's being enriched constantly by a reciprocal amplification between the parts of this multiplicity, which is to say that these shifting moments of emotional movement are like the differentials or fluxions within a curve, and that the way that the multiplicity forms unity is sort of implicit and requires us to go through it. And we will never understand it so long as we try to add together an infinite number of translations like tangents to a curve. And the sort of inner curve of Moonlight Sonata, we might say its spirit or its soul, looks at this evolving continuity within the duration of the song, which is enveloping a growing multiplicity of tones and emotions, which is constantly reintegrating them in an irreversible succession, and involves a progression through which our power of acting is intensified, and where we continuously dilate the tension of our consciousness, relaxing, on the one hand, the tension of our attention to life, this practical engagement and all of the habits that go with it, analysis and juxtaposition, In this continuous creation of an infinity of details and nuances, the composer has created a patterning and organization, a form which is irreducible to the notes alone, but also which weaves together these shifting emotions in a progressive development of a feeling. And no doubt, the song leaves a qualitative impression on us as a whole, which can't be just the overlaying of each emoji on the others, nor is it anything like an average taken of all of these emotions, or sort of eliminating the differences between each of these emotions and just rendering out what is similar between them. It's none of those things. It's none of these analysis or estimation. And in a way, this doesn't require anything like a synthesis where we're taking each of these feelings, abstracting it from the situation, and then somehow putting them back together actively in our mind. No doubt we make some connections in a way kind of like this. Somehow we contrast the happier chords with the sadder chords. We can sort of juxtapose these moments in time next to one another to think about them. But, too, you would never actually compare these two things if you hadn't already felt some contrast and relation between them. And we are fully capable of following along with the song and living it out without this intellectual comparison needing to come in. And arguably, we feel these interconnected comparisons between different moments in the song more clearly and more vividly if we just let ourselves feel them and don't try to think about it. And in order to listen really closely to music, Bergson thinks that we don't just follow along, but we're actually sort of inventing the music for ourselves as we listen to it. We're engaging in the inventive process of the song itself. And since this invention is going to have to involve intelligence, creativity, imagination, we engage those aspects of ourself when we listen as if we were the one creating it. And so Bergson considers this relation between intuition and intellect in the second introduction and says, quote, "We can give things whatever names we choose, and I see no great objection, I repeat, to knowledge of the mind by the mind still being called intelligence, if one insists. But then it will be necessary to specify that there are two intellectual functions, the one the inverse of the other. For the mind thinks mind only by climbing back up the slope of habits acquired in contact with matter, and these habits are what one currently calls intellectual tendencies. Is it not better to designate by another name a function which certainly is not what one ordinarily calls intelligence? I call it intuition. It represents the attention that the mind gives to itself, over and above, while it is fixed upon matter, its object. This supplementary attention can be methodologically cultivated and developed. And that's on page 92 or 78, depending on your edition. So intuition and intelligence are in some sense inseparable. They're both activities, and they're both affects, right? In this sense of a change to the power of acting. The intensity is in proportion to the continuity of our attention and our effort. So the intensification of intelligence or intuition is always linked to this continuity of effort and attention. So sometimes the mind is more purely intellectual, and this will mean being less intuitive. But the inverse is not necessarily the case. To be more intuitive or purely intuitive doesn't mean to not be intelligent, even if it definitely does mean being less intellectual. It takes intelligence to be less intellectual. It takes intelligence to form an intuition. And here we're talking about the flexible and subtle intelligence, which is the integrative and inventive activity of creation. And it is one which hasn't fully stepped outside of our embodied motricity or our imagination. It is continuous with our embodied intelligence and our emotional understanding. It is the understanding of a melody. It is the intelligence which follows in emotions and in sensations and grasps immediately a extremely detailed sense or meaning or a concept that is completely unique and particular to the sensible and emotional space of a song. This is exactly the kind of intelligence that a performer has and which allows them to play extremely expressively. A subtle intelligence of both the instrument and a great deal of skill, of course, but also a subtle understanding of emotions and the feeling that they are conveying in playing. And according to Bergson, art is always aimed at the singular. It has singularity and heterogeneity and emotional intensity as its object, and these are singular both in the pattern that they involve. Each song has a singular pattern, but they also have the object or the goal of inciting a unique event of emotional intensity every time that someone listens to the song. So it has this singular quality in the sense that it's what is happening in this moment of one's life while one is experiencing it, and that will have singularity. And so while art is intuitive, it is not what Bergson would call philosophical intuition, because philosophical intuition has the mind as its object. It has understanding the mind as its object, not simply creating this singular event of feeling. So philosophical intuition seeks to go one step further than artistic and aesthetic intuition. It is the invention of a new form of intuition. So let me end here by looking once last at this idea of invention, which we have talked about already. When the mind studies itself and does so without projecting the apparatus of matter manipulating concepts, it concentrates itself by concentrating on itself. It intensifies its power of action and acts in a new way, which unlocks new possibilities on the horizon. Intelligence becomes intellectual through habit, but intelligence in and of itself is much more dynamic and inventive. Bergson says that children are naturally inventive and are suspicious of rules and drills that are simple, routine, rigidity enforcement, and without sense and play. And children are more drawn to this playful intelligence that is inventive rather than this categorical, rigid structure of intelligence. And in this sense, the intelligence of children, which is inventive, is closer to nature in its creative advance. Adults are socialized and have the function of socializing each other and children, and they seek to turn the inventive and intuitive into something more predictable, static, and habituated. We attempt to normalize children by subduing this inventive and by inculcating this intellectual and static. And here's a quote from page 101 or 86, depending on your edition. Quote, "There is no doubt that each of these results acquired by humanity is precious." Here, parenthetically, Bergson is talking about the structured forms of knowing through language and the categories of science. Continuing the quote. But that is adult knowledge, and the adult will find it when he needs it, if he has simply learned where to look for it. Rather, let us cultivate a child's knowledge in the child and avoid smothering under an accumulation of dry leaves and branches, products of former vegetations, the new plant which asks nothing better than to grow. And from the page before that, he says, a learning which is bookish from the outset compresses and suppresses activities which were only waiting to surge forth. This inventive intelligence is a sort of innate impulse in us, but society and convention and culture and normalization, especially within the West, have the effect of deadening and suppressing these energies. And here I'll end with a quote that I feel really just pulls this all together. One might just as well say that all truth is already virtually known, that its model is patented in an administrative offices of the state, and that philosophy is a sort of jigsaw puzzle where the problem is to reconstruct with the pieces society gives us the design it is unwilling to show us. One might just as well assign to the philosopher the role of the attitude of a schoolboy who seeks the solution, persuaded that if he had the boldness to risk a glance at the master's book, he would find it there, set down opposite the question. But the truth is that in philosophy, and even elsewhere, it is a question of finding the problem and consequently of posing it, even more than of solving it. For a speculative problem is solved as soon as it is properly stated. By that I mean that its solution exists then, although it may remain hidden and, so to speak, covered up. The only thing left to do is to uncover it. But stating the problem is not simply uncovering it, it is inventing. End quote. So above all, what we need and what intuition gives us is the opportunity to not simply respond to the situation as it has been articulated already, to go beyond the terms and the system of signs which we are familiar with. It is the possibility of thinking a thought that is truly new. It is not just a rearrangement of pre-existing parts. And we see this in Bergson's approach to philosophy. He is not trying to reconcile, for instance, the intellectualist views of the Neo-Kantians and those reductivist views of mechanistic empiricism. He refuses to understand the problem in the terms that society and the scientific and philosophical communities had developed at that point in history. He seeks to approach these questions in a new way altogether, thereby reposing those problems and, in a way, dissipating and dissolving the false problems that come from their approach. Intuition is not simply a better argument than other arguments. It's not a system of demonstrative propositions, but rather the event which transforms the way that one understood the problem to begin with. And philosophy has more to do with posing better questions rather than figuring out clever ways of solving questions already posed.